everyone. Welcome to Guiding Light. I'm Jenna Carson,
I'm Sierra Larson.
and we are so thrilled to have our special guest, Chris Berlin, with us today. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. So good to be here with you both.
Chris is a friend of mine and a mentor and teacher I met at Harvard Divinity School, and I'm just thrilled to introduce him. So I'll dive in. Chris Berlin is an instructor in spiritual counseling and Buddhist ministry at Harvard Divinity School, where he also serves as the counselor to Buddhist graduate students. His teaching ranges from counseling theory and practice and contemplative approaches in clinical chaplaincy to courses in mindfulness, resilience theory, and Buddhism. He has also been a faculty member at the Harvard Extension School for 11 years, where he teaches courses on mindfulness, resilience, positive psychology, compassion, consciousness, AI, and the contemplative arts. Chris has previously been a full-time chaplain at a Harvard Medical School cancer hospital in Boston, where he taught meditation and mindfulness to patients and medical clinicians alike, as well as integrating mindfulness into end-of-life care. Chris has also co-led numerous retreats supporting the practice and care of hospital clinical staff, mental health professionals, and chaplains through contemplative approaches to self-care and sustainability in clinical work. He is a contributing author to the seminal work on Buddhist chaplaincy, The Arts of Contemplative Care, Pioneering Voices in Buddhist Chaplaincy and Pastoral Work, and has written about resilience in spiritual loss due to adversity and trauma. Chris is a lay teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, teaches meditation and leads retreats through the Natural Dharma Fellowship in New England, and is the founder of the Clear Path Meditation Community, offering regular meditation classes, workshops, retreats, and online programming in the greater Boston area. He is also a musician and songwriter and is co-founder of the Buddhist-oriented folk rock group Satigata, which blends Buddhist chanting with original music and eclectic sounds. Chris received his Master of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School and holds a degree in Buddhist and Hindu religions and psychology from UC Santa Barbara in California. Again, welcome, Chris. We are so happy to be graced by your presence today
Mm,
and learn from you.
Thank you.
So, the topic of our conversation today is mindfulness and resilience, a new approach. And this is work that I know you've been developing for years. When I was your student almost a decade ago, that's when I started
Wow.
graduate
Wow.
school.
That's crazy.
I took a mindfulness and no, it was, what was it called, Chris?
It was
The
called, yeah,
resiliency,
it was called Change, Adversity, and Spiritual Resilience.
change, adversity, and spiritual resilience. And so you've been studying these topics. So tell us, Chris, how are adversity, mindfulness, and resilience related?
Yeah. So, the roots of this, actually, of that course that you took, came from my experiences in clinical chaplaincy, working in end of life care, and also my private practice that I had for a long time. I haven't been doing that as much lately, but in counseling and spiritual counseling, especially working with people who've been through cancer treatment or people with PTSD, that kind of thing, and using a contemplative approach to help create that what we call resilience, which is an odd term, and we'll get into that in a moment. What I found as a chaplain, though, was how interesting it was that people could be facing such dire uh, prognoses and diagnoses. Cancer cancer diagnosis, I think, is traumatic for most people. You don't want to hear it, but when you actually do, it basically rocks your world, right? The whole fabric of your sense of safety comes undone under your feet. And I, I guess I've been amazed as to the patients and how they've been able to even say things like, "Cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me." How is that possible, right? For someone to say that, and what it pointed to in just about every occasion was that for a lot of people, they go through their lives just not really paying attention to the present moment. Life is so busy. I often think of my life as full of nothing but triage. That's a term we use in chaplaincy, where you're just attending to whatever in the given moment really needs your presence, needs your responsiveness, whether it's teaching or, being a Dharma teacher, that kind of thing. So, um, and also being leader of a community. We had a death about a month ago of one of our members, and so everything kind of gets put on hold in order to attend to friends and to that situation. So once somebody gets a diagnosis, occasionally somebody will feel like, you know what, it was the first time in my life that everything came into focus as far as what really matters. And so, in some respects, that situation can be both a curse for somebody, especially physiologically, and the uncertainty of it, as well as a blessing in the sense that uh, they may leave a job that was too stressful, or it may motivate them to sort of trim away whatever has been pretty trivial and yet stressful in their lives and focus in on what really matters. And for a lot of people visiting a chaplain, that can be spirituality. It's an opportunity for that to open. Now, for some people, though, it can be a situation in which they feel separate from God or from their spiritual resources because they feel like, wow, why am I having to go through this? What did I do to deserve this? Or why is God punishing me? And that's very, very common. And so our work as chaplains is to kind of help think through those narratives, those theological narratives that basically serve sometimes to separate people from God or from their spiritual resources, from their practice, whatever it may be. So anyway, that's kind of the soil out of which I started having questions about what is it that um, helps people feel connected and strong in their faith, as opposed to feeling distant, confused, betrayed when real adversity in life happens. And then I pointed that question onto myself. How do I deal with adversity? How do I deal with a challenge that feels insurmountable? And I started noticing these patterns that I've had my whole life arise. Things like just instead of going, hey, this is a great challenge, I'm going to nip this in the bud and then I'll be better off afterwards. We want to feel that way. And yet for me, there was often a feeling of powerlessness, helplessness, giving up. And I always found that to be a very strange response. And yet it was really deep, you know? So I started doing research, um, both in the field with patients and also how meditation, how mindfulness can actually help turn those narratives around and reach people at a deeper level. Um, so for me, what I call the threshold of resilience, that sense of how far does resilience carry me, or at what point does my sense of resilience start breaking down or feel like I can't access those resources? To what degree is that threshold impacted through meditation practice, through spiritual practice, both in life and also for our faith itself? So that began kind of my inquiry and led then to this course that I called Change, Adversity, and Spiritual Resilience. And a lot of the research there is interdisciplinary, drawing on positive psychology, on resilience theory, and in that sense, just a myriad of definitions for resilience. And that piqued my interest. Why is this such a strange word to define? Yeah. And some people even having an allergy to that word. Just in the words of Emily Click, I think who you remember, Jenna. She always used the word allergy, like you have an allergy to a particular thought or viewpoint. And there are people who have an allergy to this term resilience. And why is that? Why would this not be a good thing? And then Buddhist psychology, which is sort of my home, has been my home for pretty much 30 years now. And how does mindfulness and Buddhist psychology help to kind of fill out that vision of resilience? And especially in times where we're really feeling challenged and facing what we call adaptive challenges, as opposed to going, oh, I know this problem, I can just fix it. if I just do this, it'll get better. But so much of the significant challenges in our lives that lead to growth aren't like that. We have to look for the answers, whether it's relying on prayer, on deep listening, or other sources, our creativity. So there's a lot there that I began uh, kind of exploring and realizing, wow, this is really multi-layered here. It's a holistic inquiry. So that kind of started then my own research into resilience theory and kind of exploring the terrain. Yeah. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure
Yes,
I responded to exactly what you were asking.
it's great. I'm I'd like to ask why you do think people have an allergy to this idea of resiliency. And then I'd love to hear some big takeaways that have come out of you creating this course and some takeaways for our listeners.
Yeah, so I think, and I can't speak for others, but I think that some people are averse to the term because of how it has been handled and described in various sources. One, that there are resilient people, which assumes that there are non resilient people.
Mm.
And so it kind of separates people out into these categories of, oh, this person has a resilient personality, this person doesn't. And I think that's a really valid question because I don't buy that approach to it. I've never known anybody who's not resilient in some way at some point. So it's not quite that cut and dry. And so you have, some thinkers and psychologists who say, well, some people are more resilient than others. Um, but how do you know that? How do you measure that? And how do you measure resilience? If you're just measuring it based on emotions, like if somebody gets angry, oh, well, they must not be terribly resilient. But we all get angry, right? And that anger doesn't necessarily have to diminish our life. We're a human being. This is just what arises in us when we feel afraid of something or, you know, we encounter some kind of injustice or whatever, um, or some kind of wrong that was done to us, then we're going to get angry. That anger is not the problem. Now, the narrative around it can be a little more problematic, meaning, oh, all people are like this, kind of the biases that come out of it. But that I was never satisfied with that. Or somebody who's depressed, does it mean they're not resilient? Of course not. Of course they are. In fact, they've had to learn how to live a life to cope, to manage with depression. And that's something, if you've never had any kind of period of major depression, you may not have that kind of internal structure to know how to cope with it until you have to cope with it. So I think how we look at resilience is something that's gotten some criticism. And I joined it too. I was never satisfied with those answers. So I think that's one of the reasons that some people have really kind of had that allergy to that word. The other thing is uh, there can be a reductive approach to this term resilience, such as bouncing back, right? We
Mm.
hear this a lot. Resilience is bouncing back. But what are you bouncing back to if you've just been through a life changing situation of adversity? Is it fair to expect people to bounce back when they're not going to be the same after what they went through? And it doesn't even have to be a life changing cataclysm. It can be just expecting someone to be the same before they went through a trial of some kind in their lives. So that doesn't work. That comes from the chemical sciences, that term, bouncing back. Resilience comes from the chemical sciences. So, like, you test a substance, its integrity, when you put a lot of weight on it, does it, when it sags down and you take the weight off, if it bounces back, that substance is resilient. But people aren't like that, right? Humans aren't just this kind of substance that you can press and expect to bounce back because we are complex and we end up being different. So it's more like perhaps bouncing forward, if you will, if we're going to use the bouncing analogy. I think that's the only place we can bounce to. So, it's a lot of those, I think, inconsistencies with human behavior, and yeah, that have led to some suspicion around that term. But like I said, I can't speak for other people. Those are some things that I felt like this is not enough to explain any of what my experiences were. So the second part of your question was,
Just before we move on, I'm hearing a lot of like the corrections of w what people think resiliency is and what it's not. How would you define it, in a way that if people just kind of really can't grasp this concept, what for you is resilience?
yeah, I would define it first of all. It's multi-layered. It is multi-layered, and this is why, in my work, since so I didn't have this framework when Jenna, when you took the course, what, 10 years ago, but I've identified kind of four primary categories, all of which refer to resilience. So it's multi-layered. It's also not a thing. It's not a trait, but it's a process. It's a dynamic process that comes and goes, and it's influenced by many factors. So, for some people, it can be, of course, there can be a genetic component in the sense of, uh, our central nervous system, and to what degree, what kinds of adversity or stress, chronic stress, are we able to bear based on our physiology and our brain physiology. And it may look different in different people, but that doesn't mean that this person's resilient and that isn't. It just may express itself differently. Um, but then there's also, uh, there's the epigenetics. Epigenetics are sort of added qualities. They're not encoded into DNA, but they are features that basically become habitual, and then those can be passed down also from our parents. And it's interesting to look at, like in my case, intergenerational trauma, um, to see, wow, what have I received, like from my father primarily, who went through the firebombing of Dresden in Germany in 1945, and was traumatized terribly by it. And then he and his family were refugees in the countryside, and in their own country, and all of this. And of course, that whole time was horrible for everybody. Um, but and then learning the trauma of learning about the camps, and what was being done during the Holocaust. Anyway, there's some of that I know that I've inherited from my father's lineage, whose mother was Jewish, by the way, in Germany during that time. So there's a lot there's a lot there, and that's what we would call epigenetic conditioning, I guess, on how we respond to things. Some of the perhaps sense of safety and well-being. But then there are conditioning factors. How were we raised? What experiences have we had when we were kids? Did we grow up with chronic stress? For example, if we grew up poor, uh, or if somebody has been raised with an alcoholic parent, or somebody with substance abuse and always struggling, or maybe the parents weren't even around, that's going to shape how we see ourselves in the world, in a sense of kind of safety, and um, whether we trust people or not. I mean, there's so many things there that can then intrapsychically impact how resilient we feel. Um, so when I define resilience, it's really kind of nuanced and multi-layered. So for me, it's kind of like, what is it that we're talking about? Are we talking about surviving? Are we talking about thriving? Are we talking about spiritual growth? These are sort of different shades of resilience. So it's a dynamic process. It's multi-layered. Um, it has many factors that have gone into what I call the threshold of resilience. Um, yeah, but I don't think it's a thing or a personality trait, and that's my gripe with the clinical field. You know,
Do you think, Chris, it would be fair, and I know this is an oversimplification, do you think it'd be fair to say that resiliency is the way in which humans respond to adversity?
I think so, and yes, I think that's a good uh, it's a good partial definition, because it also, for human beings, I think it implies growth. fundamentally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
It's just part of it, right?
Exactly, and it's what do I do with this experience that I've been through? So, for example, if somebody has gone through a trauma of some kind, and I know a lot of veterans, I've actually worked with veterans in the past around PTSD, traumatic brain injury, moral injury, and how contemplative practices can help some of those things skillfully, if they're skillfully done. And um, what you find is that when someone is able to integrate, you can't outrun some of those things, right? Because they're buried so deeply. But if someone's able to integrate what they've been through into some kind of generativity, into some kind of giving back or working with others, then you start seeing this growth process where they've not only adapted because of what they've been through, but now they've been transformed by it and are giving back to others because they care through compassion, through a sense of service or a sense of purpose, a calling, as we say in divinity school. They've had a calling to help others, and you see this a lot with people who've been through significant challenges and adversity. Is they end up wanting to work with other people who've been through this to help guide them. Um, and I mean, like the work that you two are doing in terms of women in the church and really advocating for their own empowerment um, is kind of a form of that because you've been through, you
Mhm.
know what it feels like. You've been through those challenges, and yet you're learning how to metabolize them into something really wholesome and generative, not just for yourselves, but for others too in your situation. So that's both adaptive. It's an adaptive form of resilience, and it's also transformative, which is another one. So those are the sort of item 3 and 4 of the typologies. Um, Adapting through your creativity, through your inspiration, through growth, and then transformation.
Yes, you
Yeah.
mentioned the typologies, and I
Um,
believe you have four typologies.
I just wanted to touch on what you said about growth before we move on, just because when you were talking about the definition of resilience being, an inherited trait or like, part of a personality, that's a really fixed mindset. That's really
It
just
is.
like you have it or you don't, you're born with it
Exactly.
or you're not. So I love how you brought in growth and the idea of resilience being something that you can grow into. And it's a growth mindset. It's something that you can learn how to do or learn skills to enhance. And then once you've grown and become somebody that kind of like figured it out, I guess, not all the way maybe, but you've gotten to the other side to like be able to look back and help others go through it as well. And that perspective of resiliency is not just like something, how limiting it is to think that it is just a trait, right? Oh, I have it. There's nothing you can do. Like I just have it, you don't. But to say like, no, I learned this. I've grown, I've adapted, I've changed, and I've become stronger, and you can too. You almost become this personal trainer, right? This like in this strength journey for someone who is going through something similar and just saying like, yeah, let me help you through this from someone that has grown in resiliency. So I wanted to point that out because I loved how you you said that. I think that's really, yeah, thank you.
I love that term, personal trainer. In a way, that's what chaplains are. We're personal trainers for people's spiritual lives. Hopefully, it doesn't mean we give them the workout we do, but we're able to help them find the workout that they need to do in order to grow, to transform, to get stronger. In their faith or in their worldview, whatever it might be. Yeah, that's a great way to say it. Yeah. The
I
other.
also loved Chris. Oh, go ahead, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, please go on. Yeah.
How you talked about metabolizing our experiences and creating something wholesome. Um, we talk a lot in divinity school about making meaning, meaning making. in our lives and as chaplains, we help people as they are making meaning of tragic experiences in their lives. And a lot of times, what we go through in life feels meaningless, especially when it comes to suffering. We, those of us who have deep, deep losses of loved ones who we may feel are taken from this life too early, a lot of times it's very hard to find meaning in that event of loss. And yet, in resiliency, we see this metabolizing of the loss and coming to a place where you can pour into others something of yourself that has resulted from this loss. So, for example, Carrie Maloney had mentioned, not in our podcast, but after we spoke with her, mothers who have lost children to drunk driving
Mm,
incidents
mm,
come together and create support groups and work together in causes to help other people who have lost children. So you can see this amazing way that humans just keep showing up for each other in the aftermath of very tragic, meaningless sufferings.
yeah,
And that is, I'm just in awe of the way that humans do that. You mentioned working with veterans. And so I just wanted to highlight um, that there's this paradox of, some of these things we just can't make sense of. And yet we just keep transforming our lives and other people's lives.
that's well said. Yeah, and I also think faith. That's maybe where faith is uh, not really knowing how, but just giving it over. Like in Buddhism, we have this notion that whatever you can't hold, give it to the path. The path will hold it for you.
Mm,
I imagine in Christianity, give it up over to God. God will hold it, or Christ will hold it for you until you can hold it for yourself. And that's really important. And it's one of the first things to go when people are really struggling, um, is to forget that you don't have to hold it by yourself. You don't have to hold whatever has happened. You're being accompanied. And so sometimes helping people change the narrative, the what I call the theological reframing, that maybe God's not punishing me. Maybe God is weeping with me that I'm having this experience. Um, God doesn't want me to suffer, perhaps. But I don't understand why God's not making this go away either. And this is where people can get caught. And it's hard to have patience with the process because for us, it can feel like an eternity. And for the divine, it can be just a blink. Our frame of reference is so different from ultimate reality. So, um, anyway, the other thing I think that I found interesting is kind of the aspect of, so what is it then that undermines a sense of resilience? We talked about emotions not being good predictors of that because we all have them, right? Even resilient people get angry or depressed once in a while. But there's something deeper. There's something else that can impact, I think, our sense of how resilient we feel. And for that, I draw on the work of Erica Rosenberg, who also is a Tibetan Buddhist. I think she's at Stanford. She's done a lot of research on um, the difference between moods, emotions, and what are called affective traits. And affective traits, this is kind of where the goods are. Emotions, things like happy, angry, sad, these are sort of more short term experiences we have. We get angry, oh, and then we see this friend that we love and we feel joyful the next minute, or maybe 10 minutes later, maybe the next day. Sometimes it can take longer. But, it's like the ripples on the surface of a pond. And so those are constantly changing. So those aren't good predictors. But what perhaps are these deeper currents of feeling states. They're not necessarily emotions, but they're things like helplessness, powerlessness, shame, which often is seen as an emotion, but actually it's more of what we call an affective trait. It's a deep feeling state that kind of moves what sometimes it's unconscious. We don't even know that that's what's acting on us, but it shapes how we see ourselves and how we see the world and how we see ourselves in the world. It shapes, I think, can shape our relationship to our spirituality. And those are kind of the areas I think where we can really look, and where mindfulness and meditation and prayer and contemplative practice can actually dive a little bit deeper and impact the sense of whatever affective trait is working on us. And by the way, these aren't negative things. Gratitude is an affective trait. Feeling grateful can also be an emotion. It comes and then maybe it goes again. But really, there are some people who just live life with a lot of gratitude. I don't know if you've known anybody like this, but they're just always grateful. This is how they relate to the world. And so in that sense, it's an affective trait. It's a deeper current of how they feel in the world. Resentment, hostility, um, sort of a generalized sense of anxiety or feeling unsafe. Again, we can discuss these in the terms of emotions, but they're really affective traits. So let's say we do a loving kindness meditation, or we do a deep meditation on self compassion in the aftermath, maybe of some kind of violation. It's amazing what that can then do to help start reshaping how we feel about ourselves. If there's shame or blame there, deep self compassion practices that we have, like in the Buddhist tradition, can really start to untangle some of the ways we relate to ourselves and start bringing more self-love. And in this case, not narcissistic love or self-involvement, but really self-acceptance that frees us from just all of that stuff, the shadow side, right? The stuff that really roots us in suffering, so that we can be more free to give love to others in a way that's healthier and less laden. So that's an important part. And I think when we talk about resilience, we're also looking at some of the pieces that we call affective traits in our lives. And one thing that I think one of you just mentioned is that, yes, you can practice resilience. You can cultivate it. And the positive psychologist Martin Seligman, who's kind of one of the pioneers of what we call positive psychology, did studies with marginalized children who grew up in poverty with a lot of adversity in the home, abuse, substance abuse, misuse, that kind of thing, who in school would feel what he called learned helplessness, where they learned basically that whatever I do, it will never be good enough. I'll never be able to do well in school. And of course, then that impacted everything else that they did when they were in school. But they trained these children to be more optimistic, learned optimism, basically. And what they found was that these kids started excelling and doing better in school, and their whole sort of outlook and attitudes changed. And it's quite remarkable that we can actually, because of neuroplasticity, because of brain, and we can change these habits, these sort of deep grooves in the brain that have arisen out of just the habitual responding. So even on a neuroscience level, it's possible to shift kind of all that into a more wholesome direction. That doesn't mean it's easy, right? But it's possible. So we can, with intention and clarity and awareness, we can actually cultivate a stronger sense of resilience. Yeah.
Oh, I love those three words. Say them again. Is it intention, clarity, and awareness? Was that it?
Yep, you got it.
Oh my goodness. I love that. And I love that in the sense of everything you're discussing, because intention, being focused. What am I doing? Being proactive. I'm going to set my focus on the things that I want to see in my life, clarity. Okay, seeing things clearly for what they are, not through the lens of, trauma, or the lens of shame, or the lens of resentment, but taking kind of those off and saying, what is? Not what do I think,
Mhm.
not what, what others think, but what is. And having clarity on the actual situation and like sense of self, who am I really,
Mm.
without the judgments that I'm putting on myself. I love that. And then intention, clarity, what was the last one?
Awareness.
Okay, yeah, an awareness of like where are we now, not being focused on the past or so worried about the future, but just being here and now with what is and aware of what you have too. Like you're talking about gratitude. Gratitude is just being open and aware of all of the things you do have
Mhm.
and being glad in that. And so I love those three things that you just said because I'm just like, oh my goodness, of course if you mix those three things together, and obviously there's way more to that, but even those three things, you know, talk about strengthening that resiliency muscle. Like, absolutely. I love all of that. That's amazing. Thank you.
I would also add uh, love in there too.
Mhm.
It's like I don't remember which scripture it is in the New Testament. Maybe it's Corinthians, where Jesus says he compares these qualities, but says among all of these, the highest is love. And
Yeah.
it's incredible what we're not talking necessarily about romantic love, but big love,
Mhm.
big love, and um, yeah, I think that can help when there's loss. It doesn't make all the bad feelings go away. It doesn't make just immediately vanquish grief, but it really helps to work with it more deeply. And in my experience, it really, a marriage that I had had for 20 years, when it finally sort of we went our own ways, very painful period. It was really that big love um, that helped me metabolize all that sorrow, the loss, of a best friend and what I thought was a soulmate, and but it really transformed my practice, and it allowed my love to be even bigger and more ubiquitously available, even to the point of gratitude, which I always struggled with. I always struggled when I was younger with gratitude, just being grateful because I was always focused on what I don't have, or what I want to accomplish, or what I want to have come into my life. All of that kind of entitlement, you know. Um, but it was really intentionally practicing gratitude in a certain way that went deeply into the affective trait, um, that transformed all of that. And so now I just have so much gratitude. Maybe it's age too. As I'm getting older, I'm just grateful. But yeah, but love is a big part of it. Maybe it's
How
all.
does, go ahead, Chris.
I just said maybe it's all of it. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I've only ever known you as a very, very grateful person, so it's hard for me to imagine a different version of Chris.
Well, thank you.
Um, we've been really talking about mindfulness. I mean, these are mindfulness techniques, being present, having intention, being aware, accessing the love with a capital L, the the love that transcends temporal nature of things. So can you tell us how mindfulness can transform our personal resiliency
Mm, yeah.
and what you would recommend to listeners who may feel a little intimidated listening to a Buddhist practitioner who's been seeped in mindfulness for decades? Our listeners might be wondering, where do I start?
Yeah,
What would you tell them?
that's a great, great question. First of all, I would say that you're a lot stronger than you think you are. You are more resilient than you can possibly imagine. That's the first thing. And it may be hard to feel it, and that's fine too. You don't have to feel it to know that you have these resources that you just can't get to right now, especially when things are challenging. But others may see that in you, that you have this resilience. When I walk into the room of a patient, or I'm with someone who's suffering, I'll be able to look and see, in Buddhism, what we call their Buddha nature. or they're kind of their own sort of expression of the Holy Spirit. That might be a different, also another way to say it, but I can see that in them. I can see that potential. It doesn't mean I devalue the suffering, but it's important for me just to walk in so I can be a placeholder for that until they can
Mm.
see it in themselves. And how I relate to them matters. As far as like, what to say to someone, I think that it's important to also look at these four stages of resilience and not just to say, oh, I'm not resilient or I am, but it's more a question of what part of me is, and how do I not feel resilient? Where am I not feeling very, where am I not doing very well with this, right? And that's why I divided this into four categories. The first one is what I call a latent reflexive resilience, which is that you just inherently, as an organism, are built to survive. Whether you're a human being, whether you're a tree or an insect or a virus, your your will to live is really strong, and you can trust that that's true. This is what makes dying so difficult, I think, for people at the end of life. Dying itself is not hard, but it's counterintuitive to ourselves as organisms to let go. So there's a lot in the body seeks to keep living. This is why there's this struggle almost between life and dying, but it's that impulse to keep living that causes so much of the suffering, I think, in the body. And that's because that's the latent reflexive impulse working itself to keep going. Um, there's also what Carl Rogers called the self-actualizing tendency. Carl Rogers was sort of the father of American psychotherapy. And he said, everybody has this. And you may not know that you have it, you may not feel it, but we're like potato plants. I don't know, Jen, if you remember this analogy in class, but he saw people like being like potato plants. If you grow a potato in a really dark basement with this tiny opaque window all the way on the other side, how will that potato plant grow naturally on its own? It'll grow towards the window. We're like that too. We just don't always know it or feel it, but we're always going to move towards the luminosity, towards the light in one way or another. And so that's what I call that latent reflexive. It's there, it's baked in, but it's hard to feel sometimes. Yeah, Sierra.
I Yeah, sorry, my biology nerd just came out a little bit when you talked about phototropism. In school, I also studied something called gravitropism. So it's not only that we grow towards the light, it's whatever orientation, like you can turn a plant upside down and it's still going to grow up. So
Wow.
it's not
Wow.
even just that we grow towards light or we seek light, we also seek elevation too. And
Mm,
so sorry, my like biology nerd
love
just came
that.
out when you talked about that, and I was like, ooh, there's another level to this. It's not only the, phototropism, it's gravitropism too. Like we're gonna grow higher and we're gonna grow towards more light. So I love that. Sorry, I just had to put that in there before you moved on.
You know what would be a great title for a book?
Mm,
Higher, farther, wider, uh, deeper,
mm,
all directions.
All directions.
I love that.
Um,
That's awesome, Sierra.
I love that. Yeah.
So
But it's
it's
that
baked into us.
gravity.
It's who we are. It's who we are meant to grow toward the light, up
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
deepen. So tell us, so that's the first.
Yeah, so that's what I call latent reflexive. And my
Mhm.
students don't like that title. They said, it's confusing. They don't know what it means. We could call it elemental. Maybe that's a more
Elemental.
palatable term, you know. But the second one then is what I call sustainable resilience. And that's what we can call coping. Some people will say grit. Like there's this term people associate with resilience. Well, you've got grit, like you could tough it out, or enduring something. And so that's another layer is sometimes, we can cope with things, sometimes we can't, or sometimes we'll practice things that what we can call maladaptive coping, such as, let's say, you've been through something really awful and you go into a bar and just drink yourself into a stupor just to cope with it. And that's a coping strategy. It's an unhealthy one and it leads to more problems, obviously. But that is that impulse to want to endure in whatever way possible. For others, it may be, talking to friends. It helps them kind of unburden their heart and get the support they need. But really, we're talking about enduring something difficult or coping with its aftermath. And even the Buddha himself said, we often credit the Buddha with, like, oh, you just have to be mindful with everything. You have to just be loving and accepting. But, he also said sometimes you just have to endure, And when I read that, I read that several years ago when I was preparing for a class, and I went, yeah, that's good because we can't always feel those wonderful feelings. Sometimes we just have to get through something, and then we can work with it. We can retroactively maybe process it. Um, and some of that also came out of my work with cancer patients. When somebody who's going through not just cancer, but I think any serious illness, you're in survival mode through that period, getting through it, trying to get some kind of normalcy there, dealing with the treatments. But it's often not the time where people will do all the emotional processing until they feel safe. And maybe they've been given a clean bill of health. And then sometimes you'll see people fall apart at that point. And family will say, well, what's wrong? You're cancer free now, or you're in remission, or let's plan a vacation for the family, let's celebrate. And the person is like, I can't, I'm in major depression. And it comes in after they've been through it. Part of that is because the way we are as people, I think, is we process things when we can. And there are these different, there's the organism part, latent reflexive, then there's the coping part. Part of that is just surviving something, right? And then that too is resilience. But after that, when everything is quiet and safe, that's when often then all the emotional stuff starts coming out. And so part of my work with some of the clients I've had has been after the illness and going, okay, this makes sense. You're not crazy. People don't know this unless you've been through this already or you've helped people who've been through this. But now is the time to do all of that processing so you can move on with your life. But it's not time yet. And that's so hard for people to get, especially family members. So part of that too is that sustainable resilience, surviving, enduring. And then the third, which we mentioned briefly earlier, adaptive resilience, where we learn how to move with, we become more flexible with what's happening, we bring our creativity into it. We may be starting the process of growing from it, what we can call also post-traumatic growth, where we're able to start integrating and making sense of things, and the ground starts reforming under our feet a bit. But we've been able to adapt to respond to what's going on. And then that forms the ground for transformative resilience, which is also what I've called spiritual resilience. And that's where now, our whole relationship to the divine is transformed. We're different in a really wholesome way. We're maybe more compassionate, or we go to divinity school and go, you know what, I'm having this calling now, and my life has this meaning it didn't have before. That whether we call it spiritual resilience or transformative resilience, it's like sort of a culmination of our potential, having gone through difficult times. So I think mindfulness or meditation practices, contemplative practices, centering prayer, whatever it might be, actually, when we can allow that to be the path through, we may wrestle with our theology, we may wrestle with God or with the Buddha or whoever, but not giving up and going, I know I don't fully understand everything, but I know this is leading somewhere that will help me flourish more deeply in my faith. So those are the four areas. And so I think to your original question, it's been a long-winded answer to it, but um, encouraging people to think um, about it on a much more multi-layered basis, because one day you may not have that feeling of adaptive resilience, but you're coping okay. Another day, you'll feel this amazing experience of connection with the divine, and you'll start feeling transformed. Um, but maybe you just don't have the capacity for coping, but your spiritual practice is helping you get through it. Does that make sense? So we need to think, I think,
Totally.
in multi layers, and that those layers sometimes are just shifting. So
Yes.
try not to see yourself as flawed in any of these ways that where you're deficient, because what you're going through, others have been through too. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. Maybe that's a poor choice of analogy, but yeah, you're going somewhere. And as we say in Buddhism, no mud, no lotus. This
Yes.
beautiful lotus grows from just the mud of our lives of suffering sometimes. And so just know that it's
Yes.
possible, and be patient and ask for
Yes.
help. Ask for help from your chaplains, from Sierra, from Jenna, from dear friends, people support your growth. Yeah,
Yes.
I'm so
And
worthy.
there, as you said, Chris, this is layered. It looks different all the time. And I'm thinking how even Mother Nature teaches us that there will be times when we don't feel we're growing. So, for example, we know that trees will slow down their growth during adverse weather conditions. So, you can look at the rings of trees and see how they've grown over the years. And I just remember a leader in my faith community talking about how we're not meant to always be quickly growing, and we want to, but there will be days and weeks and months and years where we might feel nothing is happening. I've had times in my life where I am totally in survival mode.
Yeah,
And it takes all of my effort just to get out of bed and brush my teeth and go to work, to get out of bed and make myself a grilled cheese. Like I remember after my husband left me, I just like feeding myself was it felt like I had run a marathon, just like making a grilled cheese. I was like, okay, I've like done this massive task today. And so I just want to encourage our listeners, like wherever you are, whether you're in like the thick of the most difficult experience in your life, or whether you're feeling like you're on top of the world and thriving, it's all part of the experience. You've got this. And strengthening that mindfulness practice will help you in the highs, in the lows, and in between.
wow, well said. And breathing, that's the other
Breathing,
aspect. Just keep it simple. Keep it,
breathing.
don't have unrealistic expectations of what you should be doing. Stop shooting on yourself, basically, and just take a breath. Take a
Yes.
long breath. Don't even try to meditate. Just let yourself be fully in your body in this moment. Feel the breath just filling you with what you can't give yourself, the breath will give you. Let the breath breathe you just for a moment. Open you
Yes.
up and enter every crack and crevice of your inner space so that you're filled with that. And if it helps to then also breathe in a sense of light, to receive the presence of whatever your faith is, the Holy Spirit. This is like centering prayer where you breathe in the presence of the Holy Spirit in the form of this brightness, this luminous quality. What in some traditions we call liquid light. We just
Mhm.
imagine this inflow through the crown. Feel your crown open as you take a deep inhale and let it just fill you up with brightness. You don't have to be different. You don't have to change yourself. You don't have to do anything else. But just breathe and receive and exhale and let go. And every once in a while, but in between that in breath and the out breath, just let yourself pause for a minute, imagining that your heart opens like a flower, and then exhaling what doesn't serve you anymore, and then breathing in again. Doing that regularly will help change things on a subtle level before you ever feel it on the gross level. So part of that is good news. It's like I trust that by the time I feel the effects of my breath, it's already been working with me.
Yes, yes. Chris, I feel called to share briefly my experience learning about breath from and with you. So,
Mm,
almost a decade ago, I took a class with you and Cheryl Giles called Compassionate Care of the Dying, Buddhist Training and Techniques. And we sat to meditate. And I believe it was the first time in my life I had really sat to meditate.
mm,
And I was in so much physical and psychological pain, I could not sit still.
mm,
And I had a lot of restrictions in my physical body and struggled even to take a deep breath. And you have seen how I've changed in the last decade since you met me. Um, Everything has changed for me, and it was a process. So I just want to encourage our listeners, like if you feel like me, if you feel like you sat to breathe and you could not, you could like, whoa, I can't breathe. I'm so um, overwhelmed physically and emotionally. I
mm,
promise that there is hope and that just consistently showing up to practice will change everything for you. I have changed so much by doing what Chris said, learning to breathe. And now it's always a journey, but I'll notice throughout my day when I'm sitting at my desk or having a chaplaincy session or even kissing my boyfriend, I'll notice my breath. I'm like, oh, I'm breathing and I'm present and I feel what it is to do my work at my desk and to have a conversation with someone and to kiss my boyfriend. And it's just like pure joy because you're present. So just a little story of my own growth and encouragement for those of you who are like, I don't know how to do this. Trust me, your body will come home to
mm.
this practice of being mindful.
Oh, beautifully said. I love that. Yeah. The body is really responsive to the
Yeah.
breath in a very simple way. There's this notion in early Buddhism of nama rupa. Nama rupa is basically mind body. So it's been there a long time that the two aren't separate, but there is this quality of pneuma, yeah, that breath isn't just air and breath and relaxation, but you're also bringing in something really nourishing. Um, and it fuses, it's sort of that fusing of mind and body is what the breath offers too. Um, yeah, so namarupa, mind body, yeah, it's a thing.
Yes. Chris, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your light,
Mm,
for your love that you have poured into the world and poured into us during this episode.
mm.
Any last words of wisdom you'd like to leave with our listeners?
I think regardless of what's happening in the world, whatever is going on out there on the bigger picture, be a placeholder for love, be a placeholder for what we call fierce compassion in Buddhism. That compassion and love has a power to it, it has a strength. See if you find that within yourself to find, to not be content with polarities, but to find the truth in the middle and keep going.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you both. This has been really lovely. And let me know anytime you want me to come back. So,
Absolutely,
happy to
Chris.
do it.
And where can our listeners find you?
Hmm. Right now in the mountains of New Hampshire, but I'll be leaving later today. So, no, so I have a website, clearpathmeditation.com. You can find me on there. And I also have a YouTube channel where I upload a lot of the videos from our regular gatherings. We meet Sunday nights on Zoom. It's sort of a virtual Sangha for now. And it's a Clear Path Meditation on YouTube. If you just go into YouTube and do a search for Clear Path Meditation, there's a little green circle with a Buddha face and a Om symbol in there. That's going to be the channel. So you can also watch talks and listen to meditations, guided meditations, readings, teachings. Um, yeah, so if you're wanting to know more, you can go there as well.
Wonderful. And those recorded meditations are a gem, I can tell you all. They are
Thank you.
wonderful. So definitely check them out. Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you both.
Everyone,
Good to see you.
thank you. And to our listeners, we invite you to take some deep breaths today and maybe go check out those meditations that Chris offers online. I'm Jenna Carson,
I'm Sierra Larson.
and we hope you follow the peace.